So the title of my talk is Improving Cancer Care Through Knowledge Sharing. I want you to take a moment and think of the most frustrating experiences you've had as physicians. Those times you've had a deep, pitting feeling in your stomach, and you've thought to yourself, I wish I listened to my parents and became a dentist. Why did you feel this way? Well, for many of us, it's when we just don't know what to do for our patients. When we were in training, we thought our attendings always knew what to do. And when we would be out in practice, we would too. But the reality is that physicians have questions with almost every patient encounter. Our current knowledge resources don't help when it comes to complex and nuanced situations. And when the patient is sitting in front of us, the guidelines just don't apply to them. The result is that half of clinical questions go completely unanswered. I want you to think about that for a moment. When was the last time you had a question that was unanswered, right? The last time you thought of when who an actor was in a movie you just saw, or where Syria is on a map, or what's in Sriracha, right? You were able to find those answers somewhere online, and this is probably where you went. This does not work in medicine. So what do we do instead? Traditionally, we phone a friend. We may ask a colleague or an expert a question in the hallway, on the phone, via email, and that works pretty well, but there's a few problems with this. The first is that it only works if you have a strong network. Maybe you know the world expert in thoracic radiation after immunotherapy for oligometastatic non-small cell lung cancer and easily can get in touch, but many of us don't. The other problem is this: the valuable information and the knowledge that's shared, it's not documented. It's really not shared with anyone other than the person who's seeking out the answer. So the rest of us can't benefit from that knowledge. So a few years ago, when I was in training, this was a problem that I became obsessed with. And the reason for that was because my dad was diagnosed with cancer. He's doing great now, but at that time I had a limited network, and I reached out to everyone I knew who could help me figure out how we can get the best care for my dad. My older brother, Samir, who's a software engineer by training, watched this process and was shocked at how much physician knowledge is trapped in their heads and isn't shared with the community. Sharing information, he told me, is why the internet exists. So we worked together and we created theMednet to bring the existing question and answer process online and give clinicians access to strong expert networks. Very simply, physicians ask questions and we match those questions to experts most qualified to answer them. All answers are stored in a searchable knowledge base, so every physician can benefit from this knowledge. Anyone who has a similar question can search for it at any time. Questions address real-world clinical situations, where expert opinion fills gaps in published research and guidelines. They address challenging patient problems, the answers that can't be found in textbooks. For example, here's a question asking how you manage urinary obstruction for prostate cancer patients on treatment. I love this question because literally 1 week after it was posted, I had a patient who obstructed on treatment. So I went back and I went through these answers and I followed the advice of senior GU radiation oncologists and was able to get my patient through treatment. I hear stories like this from oncologists all the time. In addition to Q&A, members are able to create polls that give insights on practice patterns in the community. This is a question about the management of stage 1 non-small cell lung cancer with a nodal failure after SBRT, a clinical situation that didn't even exist a few years ago. Polls can provide reassurance that your practice is in line with the rest of the community, and this is something I routinely hear from oncologists throughout the country. One of the most valuable aspects is seeing how others are adopting new research into their practice. For example, 3 weeks ago, the final results of the Pacific trial were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed an overall survival benefit to immunotherapy after chemoradiation for stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer. This paper alone generated multiple Q&A asking about immunotherapy in EGFR-positive lung cancer, PD-L1 negative lung cancer, locally recurrent stage 3 lung cancer. And we were able, after a paper like this, to see what everyone else was kind of doing. That's sort of what happens. A paper comes out and you want to know, well, what's everybody else doing? Should we adopt this as standards of care? Today, the MedNet community has grown to nearly 7,500 oncologists. This includes over 90% of U.S. radiation oncologists, over 30% of U.S. medical oncologists, and we're currently launching in gynecologic oncology. Over 500 academics have answered questions, and not just any academics. Experts from every top cancer center, including many chairs, vice chairs, principal investigators of large phase 3 trials, The people who, when I have a pressing clinical question, I want to know what they would do. Experts have answered over 3,000 questions, which have been viewed over 650,000 times. The most interesting thing is that 82% of Q&A are viewed every single month, which means that they're beneficial even years after they're posted. And we have a process in place to update older Q&A so the content stays up to date. We expected answers to cite clinical experience, and most do. We were pleasantly surprised to see that most answers also cite published data, and there's an overlap of answers citing both published data and clinical experience. This is information you really can't find anywhere else. Most of the data cited, I don't know if you saw on the last. Yeah, so most of the data cited prospective clinical trials, with phase 3 trials being the most frequent data source. These answers are essentially translating how research should be come into clinical practice. Most of the questions cite clinical scenarios, with a small percentage asking about the impact of recent publications and clinical trial results. So we had proven our model. We could create a platform where community oncologists could ask their questions and experts would answer them, and the Q&A would be indexed, stored, and searchable and accessible to the whole oncology community. At this point, we took a step back and we thought, well, what about the experts? What questions do they have? And how do they get those answers? And can we do that same thing? Can we share those answers with the whole community? So experts ask their questions at tumor board. We know that tumor boards at NCI-designated cancer centers are educational sources of new information, but the conversations there don't reach or benefit anyone other than those who are present in the room. This is a lost opportunity to capture and share real-world questions and clinical expertise that can impact patient care in community centers. So we start to think about how we can move these conversations outside the four walls of an academic center and bring them to community practices. We partnered with MD Anderson Cancer Center to do just this. We created a process to distill discussions from NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center conferences into searchable Q&A on the MedNet. And this is how we envisioned it would work. Following a tumor board meeting on Monday, a faculty member would post a question from tumor board on the MedNet. The expert from that institution answers the question, and then we have it peer-reviewed at other institutions. By the end of the week, the Q&A is included in our weekly newsletter and is shared with thousands of oncologists across the country. Through this process, a discussion that happened among just a handful of physicians in a room becomes part of a searchable repository of knowledge that provides long-lasting value to 100 times or more physicians. We thought this was a great idea, but honestly, we didn't even know if it was going to work. We started with the breast cancer group at MD Anderson, and this was the first question posted over a year and a half ago. It asked about duloxetine for AI-associated musculoskeletal syndrome. The answer from MDA cited a trial that had just been presented but not published, and the PI of the trial weighed in with her 2 cents. After a couple of months, we realized this was working pretty well at MD Anderson, but would it work at additional sites? We expanded to 2 additional sites in breast cancer, UPMC and the University of Pittsburgh. We presented our results last year at San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. We found that knowledge from these 3 NCI cancer centers were able to reach 700 oncologists in 450 different institutions in 49 states. We continue to expand this program and are now up and running at 10 NCI-designated cancer centers in both breast cancer and lung cancer tumor boards. Over 100 questions and answers have reached nearly 3,000 oncologists all over the country, and we are working on expanding into GI oncology as well. Now that we have a platform where important answers from community and academic centers are discussed that help us, and they help us take better care of our patients, I want to ask your opinion. What do you think is the best source to answer a clinical question? I actually didn't put this into the website, so we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. So do you think the best source to answer a clinical question is a prospective clinical trial? Raise your hand if... All right. Is it B, an expert? Is it C, a colleague? Or is it D, a retrospective study? All right. So I agree with this. We know that clinical trials are designed to answer important questions in medicine. That's the point of a trial. But there are some major problems here. Only 2 to 3% of cancer patients enroll in clinical trials, and 70% of cancer clinical trials are delayed due to accrual problems. 25% close completely for lack of accrual. Lastly, most patients are never informed of clinical trials that they're eligible for. And the result is that important clinical questions that could change standards of care for thousands of patients go unanswered by clinical trials. Knowing that the strongest driver of patient accrual to clinical trials is a physician's awareness of a trial, we're determined to change how physicians learn about trials. Currently, oncologists search for trials when they've exhausted all their options, and at that point, most patients aren't even eligible for any trials that are accruing. So we're exposing physicians to clinical trials at the time they're asking questions on how to treat their patients. So clinical trials are the first thing they start thinking about instead of the last thing. We worked with SWOG to run a targeted, social, and personalized campaign focused on physician awareness. It was appropriately funded by the Hope Foundation, whose slogan is, "Answers to Cancer Come from Clinical Trials." In the pilot, we worked with SWOG principal investigators to develop Q&A focused on the questions the trials were seeking to answer, so that information was available to physicians at the time that they were thinking about how they were treating their patients. Clinical trial Q&A was viewed by almost 800 oncologists, and SWOG members reported learning about trials on the MedNet that they did not previously know about. So what's next for us? We're developing machine learning technology that matches actual questions to trials so that you can learn about clinical trials when you're thinking about how you want to treat your patient. And we're planning a larger study within SWOG. We've been working to figure out how to integrate traditional sources like guidelines and publications with the Q&A. An app has been one of our most consistent requests from users, so that's in the works. We're continuing to expand the tumor board program across disease sites and NCI-designated cancer centers across the country. And our next major initiatives involve expanding the MedNet across more oncology disciplines and internationally. So this is really just the beginning for us. I want to thank a lot of people who are instrumental to the success of the MedNet. Dr. Lindsay Burt is the Radiation Oncology Community Manager. She works really hard to make sure the MedNet is the most useful platform for radiation oncologists. Maitri Kalra is our Medical Oncology Community Manager. She was instrumental to expanding the tumor board program from 3 sites to 10 sites, and she currently oversees the entire program. We have an amazing team of moderators: Randa Towle at Utah, Jason Ye at USC, Brandon Mancini at Michigan, Shane Lloyd at Utah, Carrie Sandler at UCLA, Krisha Howell at Fox Chase, John Lucas at St. Jude's, David Lee at Case, Chris Wilkie at the University of Minnesota, and Omar Raghib at USC. Joseph Merriman is our Medical Oncology Community Manager, and he oversees a team of outstanding moderators. Our associates help drive the momentum of the MedNet by posting questions from community and academic practices. And our tumor board leaders are instrumental in sharing the conversations that are occurring at their academic centers with the rest of us. And then lastly, I want to thank our experts. The intellectual generosity of hundreds of experts in both radiation and medical oncology has benefited thousands of patients around the country, and I speak for all members of the MedNet when I say I'm a better physician because of all of you. Thank you.